Welcome back to the Emma podcast. As always, I'm Eric, and here with me today is Anna. Today, we're getting into AI and drug development and what regulators are actually expecting from sponsors as this becomes more embedded across the industry.
It's one of those topics where there's a lot of momentum right now. You hear about AI everywhere, especially in drug discovery and clinical trials. But when it comes to regulatory expectations, I think a lot of companies are still trying to figure out where the lines are.
Yeah, and it's interesting because regulators aren't pushing back on AI itself. If anything, they seem pretty open to it. The focus is more on how it's being used and whether companies can actually demonstrate control over it.
Exactly. It's less about the technology and more about the context around it. If AI is being used in a way that influences decisions tied to safety, quality, or data integrity, then it's going to be held to the same standards as everything else in that system.
And that's where things start to get a little complicated because AI doesn't always behave like traditional systems. You're not just validating a fixed process. You're often dealing with models that are trained on data, sometimes retrained, sometimes updated.
Right? And that raises a lot of questions around what validation even looks like in that setting. It's not always as straightforward as a one time activity.
And I think that's where a lot of teams are still figuring things out internally. You might have strong data science teams building these models, but translating that into something that fits within a regulated framework is a different challenge.
Yeah, because now you're not just thinking about performance, you're thinking about traceability. Can you explain how the model got to a certain output? Can you show how it was trained? Can you justify why it's being used in that specific context?
And even before that, there's the question of the data itself. Where did it come from? How was it cleaned? Was it representative? Because all of that feeds directly into the reliability of the model.
Exactly. If the data isn't solid, the outputs won't be either. And from a regulatory standpoint, that becomes a concern pretty quickly.
And I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked early on. There's a lot of focus on what AI can do, but not always enough focus on how the underlying data supports those outputs.
Yeah, and once you start applying that in something like clinical development, the stakes are obviously higher. If AI is influencing patient selection or trial design, you need a much clearer understanding of how those decisions are being made.
And you also need to be able to stand behind them. That's really what it comes down to.
Regulators don't necessarily need to understand every technical detail, but they do expect that the sponsor understands it and can explain it in a way that makes sense.
Right? And that expectation extends beyond just the initial use of the model.
There's also the question of what happens over time, how is performance being monitored, what triggers a reassessment, how are changes handled.
Yeah, because these systems aren't static. And that's where governance becomes really important.
There needs to be some structure around ownership, oversight, and decision making. Otherwise, it becomes difficult to demonstrate control.
And I think that's where we're seeing more organizations start to formalize AI governance.
Not just from a technical standpoint, but operationally, who's responsible for what, how decisions are documented, how risks are evaluated.
It starts to look a lot like other regulated systems once you step back and think about it that way.
Yeah, just with a different level of complexity.
And I think that's the part that's still evolving. There's no single standard approach yet, but there are definitely consistent expectations starting to come through.
Transparency, traceability, and a clear understanding of how the system is being used.
And I think that's a good way to frame it.
It's not about whether you're using AI, it's about how well you can demonstrate that it's controlled and appropriate for its intended use.
Because once it's part of a regulated process, it's no longer just an innovation tool. It becomes part of the system that needs to hold up under scrutiny.
And that's really where the shift is happening.
Companies are moving from experimenting with AI to actually integrating it into core processes. And that's where the regulatory conversation becomes much more relevant.
And in this episode, we'll get further into how regulators are approaching this, what expectations are becoming more defined, and what sponsors should be thinking about as they continue to adopt AI.
Because there's a big difference between using the technology and using it in a way that aligns with regulatory expectations.
And that's where things start to matter a lot more.
One thing that comes up pretty quickly once companies start using AI in a more serious way is when regulatory thinking actually gets introduced into the process.
A lot of the time, AI development starts in a more exploratory environment. It's focused on performance, speed, and solving a specific problem. And that makes sense, especially early on. But at some point, there's a shift where that same system is expected to operate within a regulated framework. And that's not always something that was planned for from the beginning. And
And that's usually where things start to get complicated. Not because the model itself isn't working, but because the surrounding structure isn't there yet.
you might have something that performs really well, but when you step back and try to define its intended use, document how it was built, or explain how decisions are being made, there are gaps. And those gaps become more visible once you start thinking about how a regulator would evaluate it.
Exactly. And I think the intended use piece is more important than it initially seems.
Because how you define the role of the AI directly influences how it needs to be controlled. If it's supporting a decision, that's one level of oversight. If it's actually influencing or narrowing outcomes in a meaningful way, that's another.
And what we've seen is that those boundaries can shift over time, even if the underlying model doesn't change significantly.
Right? And that shift often happens gradually.
A model might start as something that helps prioritize options or identify patterns, but as teams build confidence in it, it becomes more embedded in decision making. And that's where the expectations start to change, even if no one formally redefines its role.
From a regulatory perspective, that matters because it's not just about what the system was designed to do, it's about how it's actually being used in practice.
And that's where governance needs to keep up.
You can't just define the use case once and assume it stays the same. There needs to be some mechanism for revisiting it, especially as the system becomes more integrated into workflows.
And I think that connects directly to how these models evolve over time.
Unlike traditional systems, AI models are rarely static, or they're retrained, updated, exposed to new data sets. And each of those changes has the potential to influence outputs, even if the changes seem minor on the surface.
Exactly. And that creates a different kind of challenge when it comes to change management.
Because you're no longer dealing with clearly defined, discrete updates. You're dealing with something that can evolve in smaller, more continuous ways. And that makes it harder to determine what qualifies as a meaningful change.
At what point does an update require reassessment? At what point does it impact the validated state?
Those aren't always straightforward questions.
And I think that's where a risk-based approach becomes really important.
Not every update needs the same level of scrutiny, but there needs to be a clear framework for evaluating impact. What does this change affect? Does it alter outputs in a way that matters? Does it introduce new risk?
Without that structure, it becomes very difficult to demonstrate control.
And even beyond intentional changes, there's the question of performance over time.
Because models can drift, the data they're exposed to changes, the environment changes, and over time, outputs can start to shift in ways that aren't immediately obvious.
Right? And that's something that's fundamentally different from more traditional systems.
With most validated systems, you expect consistency unless something changes. With AI, you almost have to assume that some level of variation is possible and plan for that.
Which is why monitoring becomes such a critical piece.
There needs to be some way of understanding how the model is performing over time, not just at the point of validation. Whether that's through defined performance thresholds, periodic reviews, or other monitoring mechanisms, there has to be visibility.
And that visibility needs to be actionable.
If performance starts to shift, there needs to be a clear process for evaluating that, deciding whether action is needed, and documenting what was done.
Otherwise, you're relying on assumptions rather than evidence.
And I think when you step back and look at all of this together, it actually starts to feel less like a completely new problem and more like an extension of existing principles.
You're still dealing with control, traceability, and the ability to explain how your system works. It's just that the system itself behaves differently, so the application of those principles needs to adapt.
Exactly. The foundation doesn't change.
What changes is how flexible your framework needs to be.
And that's where organizations that already have strong quality systems tend to be in a better position. They already understand how to structure processes, how to document decisions, how to manage change.
They just need to extend those capabilities to cover AI.
Whereas organizations without that structure may find it more difficult because they're trying to build both the system and the controls at the same time.
And that's a much bigger lift.
And I think that's where we're starting to see a bit of a divide.
Between companies that are able to integrate AI in a controlled, structured way, and those that are still trying to figure out how to align it with regulatory expectations.
Because at this point, it's not really a question of whether AI will be used.
It's more about how effectively it can be integrated into regulated processes.
And that's what's going to matter moving forward.
And I think that's a good place to transition into what regulators are actually saying more directly.
Because while there's still some variability, there are definitely patterns emerging in terms of expectations, how agencies are approaching AI, and what sponsors should be preparing for.
And that's where things start to become a bit more concrete.
When you start looking at how regulators are actually approaching AI, one of the first things that stands out is that they're not treating it as a completely separate category.
They're applying existing regulatory principles, but expecting companies to adapt those principles to a more complex type of system.
So you still see the same themes come up: validation, data integrity, documentation, risk management. But the expectations around how those are demonstrated are evolving.
And I think that's where some of the confusion comes in.
Because there isn't a single unified framework yet that says this is exactly how AI should be handled. Instead, regulators are putting out guidance, discussion papers, and expectations that point in a direction, but leave a lot of room for interpretation.
Right? And that puts more responsibility on the sponsor.
You can't just follow a checklist. You need to be able to justify your approach.
If you're using AI in a specific way, you need to be able to explain why your validation strategy is appropriate, why your data is sufficient, and how you're ensuring that the system remains controlled over time.
And that level of justification is something regulators are clearly expecting.
And I think what's also becoming more consistent is the emphasis on transparency.
Not necessarily full transparency into every technical detail of the model, but enough that regulators can understand how decisions are being made and what the limitations are.
Because AI systems aren't perfect. They have biases, they have constraints, and they operate within the boundaries of the data they were trained on.
And regulators are aware of that.
Exactly. It's not about eliminating uncertainty completely or
It's about understanding it and managing it.
being able to explain where the model performs well, where it might be weaker, and what safeguards are in place to prevent that from becoming a risk. And
And that's especially important in areas like clinical development.
if AI is being used to design trials, select endpoints, or analyze outcomes, those decisions have a direct impact on how a product is evaluated.
So regulators are going to want to understand how those outputs were generated.
And I think that's where documentation becomes critical again.
Because it's not just about having the system, it's about having a clear record of how it was developed, how it's being used, and how decisions are being supported.
You need traceability from input to output.
Exactly. And that traceability doesn't happen automatically with AI,
It has to be built intentionally.
which means thinking about things like data lineage, model training history, version control, and how changes are tracked over time.
And that's where we're starting to see expectations around lifecycle management become more defined.
It's not just about developing the model, it's about managing it throughout its life cycle.
From initial design to deployment to ongoing monitoring and updates.
And being able to demonstrate control at each stage.
And I think another area where regulators are becoming more consistent is around governance.
There's an expectation that organizations have clear oversight structures in place.
Who owns the model? Who is responsible for approving changes? How are risks assessed and escalated?
Those questions need clear answers.
Right, because without that structure, it becomes difficult to show accountability.
And in a regulated environment, accountability is critical.
If something goes wrong, there needs to be a clear understanding of how it happened and who is responsible for addressing it.
And I think what's interesting is that none of these expectations are entirely new.
They've always existed in some form.
What's new is how they're being applied.
AI just exposes areas where processes may not have been as clearly defined before.
Exactly. It puts more pressure on existing systems.
If your data governance is weak, AI will highlight that. Like,
If your documentation practices are inconsistent, it becomes more obvious.
so, in a way, AI is amplifying both strengths and weaknesses within an organization.
And that's why some companies are moving more quickly than others.
Those with strong foundations can build on what they already have.
Those without it have to address those gaps first before they can scale AI effectively.
And I think that's also influencing how regulators are evaluating sponsors.
It's not just about the specific AI tool being used. It's about the overall maturity of the organization. How well do they manage data? How structured are their processes? How clearly can they demonstrate control?
Those factors all play into how AI is perceived in a regulatory context.
And that's where this starts to connect back to broader regulatory strategy.
Because AI isn't just a technical decision, it's something that needs to be integrated into how the organization approaches compliance overall.
What does this mean in practice? How should sponsors be thinking about AI as part of their regulatory strategy moving forward?
Because at this point, it's less about whether AI will be used and more about how well it's managed.
AI is no longer something that sits on the edge of development. It's becoming embedded into core processes, whether that's early stage discovery, clinical trial design, or post market analysis. As that happens, the expectation is that it operates within the same level of control as any other regulated system. That means organizations need to think about AI not just as a capability, but as part of their quality and regulatory framework.
One of the first areas this shows up is in how AI is positioned within the broader system. If AI is influencing decisions that impact safety, efficacy, or product quality, it needs to be clearly defined within that workflow. What inputs is it using? What outputs is it generating? And how are those outputs being used to support decisions? Like, without that clarity, it becomes difficult to determine how the system should be controlled.
And that lack of definition tends to create risk.
Because when roles aren't clearly established, it's harder to apply consistent validation, harder to document decisions, and harder to demonstrate control during regulatory review.
So the starting point is always clarity, clear intended use, clear boundaries, and a clear understanding of how the system fits into the overall process. From there, the focus shifts to structure. How is the AI system governed? Who is responsible for it? How are changes evaluated and approved? These are not new questions, but they take on a different level of importance in the context of AI.
Because unlike traditional systems, AI introduces variability. It learns from data, it adapts, and over time, its behavior can shift. That doesn't mean it's unreliable, but it does mean that oversight needs to be more dynamic. And
And that's where lifecycle management becomes critical.
organizations need to think beyond initial development and consider how the system will be managed over time. How often is performance reviewed? What metrics are used to evaluate stability? What triggers further investigation or adjustment?
These are the types of questions regulators are increasingly expecting sponsors to answer, not just in theory, but in practice.
And that's where documentation becomes a central piece again. Everything from data sourcing to model training to performance monitoring needs to be traceable.
Not because regulators expect to see every technical detail, but because they expect to see evidence that the system is understood and controlled. And that understanding needs to extend across functions.
AI is not just a data science responsibility, it intersects with regulatory, quality, clinical, and operational teams.
If those groups are not aligned, gaps start to appear.
And those gaps tend to surface during review,
So alignment becomes just as important as the technology itself.
ensuring that everyone involved understands how the system works, what its limitations are, and how it's being managed. That's what creates consistency.
And consistency is what builds confidence, because ultimately that's what regulators are evaluating. Not just whether AI is being used, but whether it can be trusted.
Trusted to produce reliable outputs, trusted to operate within defined boundaries, and trusted to be managed in a way that protects patient safety and product quality. And that level of trust doesn't come from performance alone. And
It comes from structure, transparency, and control. Organizations that approach AI with that mindset tend to move forward more effectively. They don't treat regulatory expectations as a barrier. They incorporate them into how the system is designed and used from the beginning,
which reduces friction later on.
and allows AI to scale in a way that is both innovative and compliant.
Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't just to use AI, it's to use it in a way that holds up under scrutiny. And that's where regulatory expectations and operational strategy start to come together.
And when you start to look at how that actually plays out across organizations, the difference usually comes down to how intentionally AI has been integrated into existing systems.
Some companies treat AI as an add on. It sits alongside existing processes, providing insight or support, but not fully embedded into how decisions are made. In those cases, regulatory expectations can feel disconnected because the system itself isn't clearly positioned within the broader framework. Other organizations take a more integrated approach. They define early on where AI fits, how it interacts with other systems, and what level of control is required. That doesn't eliminate complexity, but it creates a structure that can be built on.
And that structure becomes increasingly important as the use of AI expands.
Because what starts as a single use case rarely stays that way.
A model developed for one purpose often leads to additional applications. New data sets are introduced, new questions are explored, and over time, the footprint of AI within the organization grows. Without a clear framework, that growth can become difficult to manage. Processes become inconsistent. Documentation varies between teams, and it becomes harder to demonstrate a cohesive approach, which is exactly the type of environment regulators are trying to avoid.
Consistency across use cases is just as important as control within a single system.
And that's where standardization starts to come into play. Organizations that are able to define common approaches to validation, documentation, and monitoring across AI systems tend to have a much easier time scaling.
Not because every system is identical, but because there's a shared foundation. Teams understand what's expected, how decisions are documented, and how performance is evaluated.
That reduces ambiguity. And it also reduces the risk of gaps appearing as new systems are introduced. Another area that becomes more important as AI scales is cross-functional collaboration.
Because AI doesn't sit neatly within one function,
It touches data science, clinical, regulatory, quality, and IT. And if those groups are not aligned, the system may be technically strong but operationally inconsistent.
for example, a model might be developed with a clear technical rationale, but if that rationale isn't translated into regulatory documentation, it creates a disconnect.
Or if performance monitoring is handled by one team but not communicated to others, issues may go unnoticed or unaddressed. So coordination becomes critical, not just during development, but throughout the life cycle of the system.
And that coordination needs to be supported by clear communication. Everyone involved should understand not just what the system does, but how it's being used, what its limitations are, and what controls are in place. That shared understanding is what allows organizations to respond effectively when questions arise. Because questions will come up, whether during internal review, regulatory interaction, or inspection, there will be a need to explain how the system works and how it's managed.
And the ability to answer those questions consistently across teams is what reinforces confidence. Another point that's worth considering is how AI intersects with broader digital transformation efforts. Many organizations are investing in new technologies, data platforms, and automation tools at the same time they're exploring AI. Those initiatives are often connected, even if they're not always managed together.
On the other hand, they introduce additional dependencies. On one hand, integrated systems can provide better data visibility, more efficient processes, and stronger decision making.
On the other hand, they introduce additional dependencies. If one part of the system changes, it can affect others.
which means that understanding system interactions becomes just as important as understanding individual components. From a regulatory standpoint, that reinforces the need for a holistic view. AI cannot be evaluated in isolation. It needs to be understood as part of the broader system it operates within.
And that's where organizations that take a more strategic approach tend to perform better. They don't just focus on individual tools. They look at how everything connects, how data flows, how decisions are made, and how control is maintained across the entire process.
That level of visibility takes time to build, but it creates a much stronger foundation. And it makes it easier to adapt as expectations continue to evolve. Because one thing that is consistent across all of this is that the landscape is still changing.
Regulatory guidance is becoming more defined, but it's not static.
New use cases are emerging, new technologies are being introduced, and expectations will continue to develop.
Organizations that build flexible, well-structured systems will be better positioned to adapt to those changes. They won't need to rebuild from scratch each time something evolves.
They'll be able to adjust within an existing framework.
And that's ultimately what allows AI to move from something experimental to something operational.
Not just something that works, but something that can be relied on, scaled, and sustained over time.
Thank you for joining us for today's deep dive. If your organization needs support aligning AI initiatives with regulatory expectations, strengthening data governance, or building structured quality systems, Emma International is here to help. You can reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com or visit us at emmainternational.com. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.